So the King's Debate Society is a pretty new society. It was founded just 4 years ago by a student who's now an alumnus. And Matthias had this vision to found a debate society where students could learn to advocate truth in the marketplace of ideas. That was his vision. So he went to another coach in the area, Steve Yano, and he's like, can I just practice with you guys? And Steve said, well, why don't you just found a society? Steve was sort of joking, but Matthias is a very ambitious person, so he took him up on it and actually started this society. So we're all very glad he did. And this is actually the first public debate that we're hosting. So we're very pleased to have this be a public debate that we're hosting with the visiting Irish debaters, and I'll have Steve Yano introduce them.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this Monday evening. I'm Dr. Steve Yano. I'm Assistant Professor of Rhetoric at St. John's University and the Director of Debate. How are you? So good to see you. Thanks for coming to this public debate. This is sponsored by King's College and St. John's University, and also the National Parliamentary Debate Association and the Irish Times, and they sponsor the Irish Tour every year. This is the 52nd Irish Times Tour of the United States. So what these three people on this side of the house had to do to come here was they had to defeat a bunch of really incredibly intelligent and brilliant speakers night after night after night in front of audiences of hundreds of incredibly smart Irish people who judged them, relentlessly judged them over and over and over again until finally they won the final debate, and then they get to come to the United States and tour around for about 3 weeks. So other places they're going on the tour include Denver and Salt Lake City and Seattle, or close to Seattle. They're going to Bellingham, which is pretty close. It's a nice place. But let me introduce them. I have my notes here. But yeah, it's really great to have, I can't believe this is the first public debate that we've done here. It's really nice, so quite good. So I'll introduce, first of all, closing opposition is Michael Conroy, right here. So the way Irish Times debating works is, and it might be kind of a blessing or maybe horrific to you if you're a BP debater in the audience, is after each round you can be judged to go through together as a team, but the judges can say, hey, you were better than your partner, and split you off and advance your partner and leave you out. So Michael is the person who's the individual winner of the Irish Times Championship, who won as the individual speaker. And you entered as with a partner, right? And then you got split, right? Okay, so that happens sometimes, so. All right, so he's a fifth-year medical student at the University College Dublin, and I asked them all at dinner what their favorite thing about American culture was so far. They just got here on Saturday, so they came directly from Ireland here. We're pretty honored to be the first stop on the tour. But what's your favorite bit about American culture so far?
Well, just 2 afternoons ago, we went to a baseball game.
It was college baseball. Yeah, the umpire. I don't remember his name. Blue was his name. All right, welcome. Next, we have Owen Kelleher, and he and his partner Elizabeth. They won the team. They were the team that went through in the final to win. I think the motion they had to debate was this House would abolish prisons, something like that. You were in favor of that, right? Oh, okay, good. Ironically, very captivating speeches, probably. I don't know. Owen is a third-year student at, oh, come on. I'll keep going if you keep booing. Owen is a third-year student at the Royal College of Surgery. Is that right? Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, RCSI. It's third year. And what do you like about American culture the best so far? Good. Yeah. All right, great. And finally, we have Elizabeth Ahern Flynn, and she's the other team winner, and she's also from RCSI, and she's also a third-year medical student. And what's your favorite bit about American culture? And that is, as determined by our judges, that's the winning answer at tonight's Quiz the Irish competition. So this debate is going to be in BP style, 7-minute speeches. I think Josiah's going to keep time. Katie's going to be chairing it. And on the proposition side, we have people who are not unfamiliar to most of you. We have Tim Barr and Nelson Kizo in the opening government from St. John's. And then we have Josh and Noah in the closing government. Right? Okay. From King's College. And then we also have Katerina over here in a closing opposition. Swinging with the Irish Times champion. So, without anything else from me, let's get the debate underway, right? Thank you.
I'm not used to wearing suits, as you can tell. So, there's a reason that after this debate, we will be going not to Williamsburg, but to Manhattan, because there are no good Irish pubs in gentrified neighborhoods. So, but what today's debate is going to be about, it's going to be about values, about how we value people and how we value property. And on our side, we value people over property. And we believe that property's only value is to improve the quality of life of people. So what happens during gentrification? Rich people, people with money, move into neighborhoods that have traditionally been poor, where the rent is low. And they do this maybe because these neighborhoods are close to city centers, that they are close to nightlife, that they just are looking for a change of lifestyle. And then as they do this, the property values go up because their consumption habits bring in lots of employment for snotty baristas and people to sell you $7 cups of coffee, where the old grocery stores go out of business. And now property values go up and property taxes go up. And so, what happens are the people that traditionally lived in these neighborhoods either have to bear the brunt of these costs, leave these neighborhoods, or become homeless. Not yet. And we believe that these are not things that as a government we should allow. We believe that gentrification is micro-colonialism, and yuppies are the new conquistadors. So, we're going to present you a model tonight that has 3 parts. The first part is we want to grandfather in the low-income, long-time residents' property taxes and say the property taxes you have now, flat rate, forever. Secondly, we want to create a board of people from the neighborhood who are going to decide how to give out rent or mortgage subsidies to people who apply for them, who are low income and have lived in the neighborhood for a long time. So if you have a certain amount of rent, you put in an application to the board and you'll get a rent subsidy if you've lived there and if you have low income. And finally, small businesses will be eligible for low interest fixed rate loans if they have already existed in the community and they are also residents in the community. What do we think this addresses? We think it addresses the primary problem of gentrification, which is the displacement of long-time communities. So the most important part to remember about this, after this point, is that there's a scarcity of low-income housing for people in cities. And when the other solutions which government use, which is to create public housing, are always failures. These places become places of violence and crime, and no one feels at home here. When we have these neighborhoods that still exist as low-income housing, we have a duty to preserve them. Yes? A community, we don't believe that our program or our policy is about stopping the change of a community. What it is about allowing people to continue to live on the low incomes that they will still have. We still will see change in the community. The kind of change we'll see with families that still grow. Because in neighborhoods that are becoming gentrified, what happens is people who don't have families tend to move in, and families are the people that tend to be pushed out. We believe that the growth of children will bring new things to the community. We believe that when people are able to afford their rent now because of our plan, they'll be able to do new things in their community and change it in that way. We don't want to stop change. We want to stop this particular type of change, which hurts poor people the most, the working poor. So, now what happens if either they move out, they accept costs, or they're homeless, right? So what happens if they move out? Why does this affect the poor the most? Because typically, the working poor that live in these neighborhoods can't afford long commutes, so they live near their jobs. So now, if they're forced to move, they either have to bear additional transportation costs to get to their jobs, they have to leave their jobs that are already poor, and since they're or already low income, it means that they're unlikely to get new jobs, and they'll have to accept unemployment. We think that because these people, as opposed to the people that have the choice to move into these new neighborhoods, don't have as much choice about where they can be employed or how long their commute can be, we need to preserve the places that they live, which are close to their jobs. We also think something that's affected in many neighborhoods, as we saw in South Africa and as we saw in Bushwick and Williamsburg, are language barriers. Some of these communities have languages which are not in the dominant culture. They speak Spanish, or they speak Polish, or they speak African dialects. And we believe that these language barriers, these language communities function in a certain way. As gentrification progresses, and now these new stores and these new businesses, which they are required to use because they don't have cars to drive, and there are no other neighborhoods that have these languages, now have products that aren't listed in their languages, and now they aren't able to speak to the people that they're buying things from, that this negatively affects their quality of life. It means that there are fewer places that they can go to purchase things. Yes? We don't, on our side, we don't believe that integration is more important than people being able to afford food, housing, and to get to work. If people want to live in a community that is Polish, we see no problem with that. And especially, we think that in a community that wants to preserve the poor, to say that what we want to value is integration even more, even if that forces people out of their neighborhood to places where they cannot integrate, that on our side, we actually do have better integration than they do. Because what we have them is integrated into an economic lifestyle that they can actually support, as opposed to pushing them to the margins of society. So that's what they have to defend on their side. We also believe that the cost of living will go up because these long-term businesses that people rely upon, and Nelson's going to touch more on about how this actually works in communities, they won't have as much ability to function in the community with the understanding of their neighbors who have known them for a long time. And the new commerce caters to the taste and the incomes of the new residents as opposed to the old ones. So now I'm no longer able to get the cuisine or the food of my people. All I can get are Trader Joe's raisins that I wouldn't eat anyway, and they're $7, and I can't afford them. And guess what? Trader Joe's doesn't take WIC. So now, what are they going to say the goods of gentrification are? They're going to say, well, this is going to desegregate our neighborhoods. Well, it doesn't desegregate. What it does is whiten. What it does is make more dominant the culture that already is, because people can no longer afford these places and they have to give them up. We don't think that that's a desegregation model. We don't think that's integration. Next, they're going to say, oh, it's better housing. But better housing for who? It's better housing for the people who can afford to improve their housing. The reason that we support a financial model rather than other models like the Bushwick model, which improves people's houses, is because that leads the way to gentrification. So when property values go up, even if I have a nice house, I can no longer afford that, and I have to sell it to someone who can. We think that the most immediate needs of the people who are the working poor is money, and that's what we're going to give them in subsidies and in low-rate loans. And finally, they're going to say higher property taxes are important for communities, but not when they put people out of work. We as a government have an obligation to the working poor and an obligation to preserve low-income housing where it still exists. Thank you.
It's great to be here. I was going to say I was going to debate in the Empire State Building. I won't tell everyone at home it's in the basement. I think I want to just pretend it's in the roof. It's at least 7 times taller than anything we've got in Ireland. We've yet to be gentrified, sadly. We were debating earlier about whether a suit. We kind of copped out and wore chinos instead of wearing suit trousers, but now I regret that choice. Merely for a style thing, because Elizabeth spends more time deciding what outfits we're going to wear for debates rather than on the arguments, as may soon become quite apparent. Oh, I'm party to this as well. That's what I spend my time worrying about for these debates too. But anyway, so on to the points. I like to summarize everything like one catchphrase. So our catchphrase is going to be afraid of change, and how you can never really decide that our civilization or our community or even our neighborhood has reached the pinnacle of what it'll ever be, and this is what we should preserve. This is where we should keep things. Because if that was the case, in Ireland, the 50s would be a pretty damn good thing to preserve. You know, traditional farmers' wives making bread for their husbands when they come home from a hard day's work on the farm, cutting turf or growing potatoes, whatever stereotypical things we do. You know, let's preserve that. Let's give them money. Let's have the EU subsidise our Irish farmers. That's what we do, actually. But I think actually Dublin's probably a more successful model, you know, where we have these great IT firms coming in, like Google and Facebook and stuff, and, you know, we actually earn a bit of money and we have a bit of fun, and we can afford to have competitions that sends off 3 21-year-olds to New York City for a couple of days. I prefer that kind of change. But that's my point, is that, like, how can any community decide that it's reached the pinnacle? How can we decide, you know, we're better than anything that we could possibly be? Let's just stop here. Let's keep these people where they are. Because I think that's really kind of, it presumes a lot, and it makes a huge value judgment on what it is. Because, I mean, I'm quite impressed in New York. It's huge. It really is. Like, you've no idea how big it is until you live somewhere that's not this big, which is like everywhere else in the world, except maybe some parts of China, which is changing. But my point is that New York did not get where it is today by saying the same. It didn't get where it is today by saying, say, back in the 50s, no, the Empire State Building is pretty good. We don't need anything taller than this. How New York City got where it is by saying, actually, you know, we can bigger buildings than this. That's what I meant to say. You know, that's how New York got where it is. It got where it is by, instead of sticking with the garment industry run by Jews, it decided to have like a big financial district. You know, like, that's how it got where it was. And that's how Ireland's getting where it is. That's how every country where it gets where it is. It's not afraid of change. It's not afraid of going forward. It's not afraid of taking a few risks along the way as well. And I think that's really what the role of government is. It's about kind of fostering this kind of change to make it a good kind of change. And that's, I think, what they agree with. But the role of government isn't to preserve things as they are just because we can't have this nice, you know, rose-tinted glasses view. Because, yeah, I mean, to my modern 21st century Irish view, a kind of the rural Irish life of the 50s where everything seemed nice and rosy seems nice. But actually, when you look into it, it wasn't very nice. And that's why these people, like my grandparents, no longer live like that and actually live in live a much better life. Change has actually been very good for Ireland, and change has been very, very, very good for the United States. And then he's got this point of we preserve these communities, but then that harms, as I think Michael brought up in the POI, and I may elaborate on a bit, about how I've got a different point, about how it impedes integration, but more importantly, it impedes kind of what America is about. You know, it's that, especially in New York, that traditional melting pot of people, of ideas. If we just try to preserve things, it leads to stagnation. It leads to nothing new. It leads to just this kind of, it's a very nice place to live, but why would anyone want to move there? And then you kind of solve your own problem, because then no one's going to want to move there. Like, the reason people want to move to places like Manhattan or move to places like Dublin is because they've got something to gain from living there. They want to go there. This place is desirable. It isn't a case of valuing people over property. It's just allowing people to put whatever value they want in something without the government standing in their way. Like, they never address the issue, the core issue. They address gentrification plenty, but they never ask, what is the role of government? Why should the government step in here and decide, you know, this community is great, let's preserve this? If that was the case, and this was still be New Amsterdam, we'd all be Dutch farmers. Because I think the city was actually a couple of miles down the road. Actually, I'll take it now before I move on.
The reason that government needs to step in is because when we allow people to just value ideas, value property, people with money are the ones that get to decide where it's valuable, and people who are poor get pushed out.
That does happen, yeah. Kind of sad, but, you know, that's capitalism for you. Like, I mean, I can't defend. I mean, I'm not like, that is capitalism. There are good parts and bad parts. You think the good parts outweigh the bad parts. Like, there's no unfettered good. But at the same time, Manhattan is Manhattan, and it's really expensive to live in because it's worth being really expensive to live in. You know, I mean, by that case, then should we do the corollary of just preserving wealthy areas for wealthy people, because that's where wealthy people want to live, and they have a very nice community that's worth preserving too. Should Park Avenue be preserved as it is, and should all poor people be stopped from moving in there? I mean, all they're advocating is just some kind of reverse classism by saying poor people are somehow different from rich people and should be kept separate, rather than kind of that nice American way that we've all grown up to in American movies, of how everyone is actually the same. and really should be the same and should have the opportunity to be the same. And yeah, okay, I mean, if someone wants to buy your property and is willing to offer you 3 times what it's actually worth, as again happened in Ireland, I suppose you maybe don't know much about a property boom and bust cycle. You know, what's wrong with that? Why should we keep prices artificially low and actually hurt these people? Because he says they can't afford it. Well, either they can sell their property or they can just move somewhere that's better value, or they can stay where they are. Prices change, things change. The fact is things change. And it's quite a... I mean, there are good and bad parts, but the fact is the good parts outweigh it. So I'll just kind of crystallize it all into things of why change is, as a good thing, is good and why we should encourage it, or at the very least, not stand in its way. And that is because change leads to new ideas, change leads to merging of people, change leads to, you know, kind of like a melting pot. Like if all the Irish people who moved to New York back about 100 years ago stayed where they are and never tried to change, we preserved those communities, we'd never have people like JFK, we'd never have people whom the Irish community spawned, who moved out, who actually helped shape America. If we just kept everyone where they were when they first arrived, then we'd have absolutely nothing to boast about. You wouldn't be the greatest country in the world. If Ireland stayed where it was in the 50s, we'd be a nation of farmers and potatoes, but we wouldn't be the leading pharmaceutical and IT country in the Western world either. That's what change is good for. Yeah, okay, we lose some traditions, but America didn't get where it is by sticking to traditions. America got it where it was by change, and we should promote change. And that's why we don't agree with what the proposition is bringing to you. So for that reason, we beg you to oppose. Thank you.
The last speaker wanted you guys to believe in change, but similar to the '08 Obama campaign, this is not change you can believe in, Madam Speaker. We heard this huge change rhetoric, like this is just going to be beneficial for everybody. But the only people he provided benefits for are the ones who are going to be moving there. What I'm going to tell you about in my split, right, is going to be about the importance of local communities, especially in these urban areas, and how it affects their day-to-day life, and what happens when gentrification happens in these areas. But first, I need to do a lot of rebuttal from what we heard from the last speaker, right? He says, well, New York didn't get to where it was by staying the same. Like the Empire State Building, he talks about the greatness of the Empire State Building. It was built, but nobody was living here when it was built, and we didn't kick anybody out as a result of it. But secondly, we have been trying to preserve cultures in New York City. Just look at places like Harlem, where we've tried to bring their culture into the forefront, into the mainstream. That's why you have shows like Showtime at the Apollo, where you try to highlight some of that culture in these areas, because the government and people in these cultures recognize that these are extremely important things and valuable to every part of society. And it's not just the important part of it. The important part of this culture isn't just because you can afford the rent there. The important part of this culture is be something that everybody can engage in that is different from where they live individually, right? But then we heard, well, this is simply capitalism for you. Change happens as a result of capitalism. There are like bad stuff to capitalism. We tell you, yes, there are bad stuff that happens as a result of capitalism. But that's why we have governments, to protect against some of the bad things that do happen as a result of capitalism. So gentrification, as we're going to say, is a bad thing, and he's semi-conceded on this. We say we're going to institute this government structure to make sure to prevent some of these bad things. We don't have to accept all of them. Just like I don't know, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Like that's part of capitalism. We had government structures to like try to prevent some of these things, right? But then we'd also say, but then he said, well, like, would we prevent poor people from moving to richer communities, such as like the Hamptons or something? We tell you that they do a pretty damn good job of protecting it on their own because the prices are pretty high to move in there. So it's not as if poor people can just like get up and move from the Bronx and say, well, I'm going to buy my new 5-bedroom mansion in the Hamptons now. We think the protection mechanisms are already there, right? But then we heard, well, they can just sell their property for a much higher rate. Like, this is a huge assumption, because the assumption that they're making is that the people who are living in these urban areas and are extremely poor actually own the property that they're in. Oftentimes what happens is that the landlord just increases the rent that they have to pay on it so much to where they can't afford living there anymore. So it's not that they have the option to sell it. It's either you meet the new rent requirements, even though your income has stayed the same, or you get out and leave and never return back to these communities. We think that that is extremely harmful, right? Go ahead, one of you, either one.
In 1960s Detroit, the cops there had an obligation to protect the wealthier inner city when it was being taken over by poor people and rich people were moving to the suburbs.
did the cops have an obligation? Like, we're not enforcing like a police state to ban these things. We're saying that like we're having a community, like we're saying that the local community can get together and have like rent subsidies to prevent people from being forced to move out of their neighborhoods. We're not saying that anything about the police having to step in on this, right? So what is the importance of local communities, especially in urban areas? We say that oftentimes local communities act as extremely strong support groups for the people who live there. And the importance of that is they base these support groups based off of who they know and how long they've lived there as part of this support group. So you can go to your local bodega, even if you don't have the money to necessarily buy bread, and they can say, we can give you this bread on credit because we know you, or we know your mother, and they have lived in that apartment for 15 or 20 something years. We say that this helps people cope with a day-to-day life in these urban areas. Why is this important? Because when living in these urban areas, you live in a constant state of scarcity, but you live on a fixed income, and this income isn't something that you can just easily adjust. And we say that the way that government reacts to this is they try to have like welfare programs, but the way government plans is that they plan on like the ceteris paribus type of thinking, right? So what they say is like all other things being equal, so like you don't get sick, or like your son doesn't break an arm playing football, this is the amount of money that you need. But we say that local communities are better they're better able to adapt to this, like to the day-to-day functionings of everyday life, right? So if your child does get sick and the person at your local bodega knows about this, they can give you a piece of bread, or they can pull resources together to help you out. We say that this is a much better thing to do. But when gentrification happens, these communities are now dispersed, because you can't just pick up Harlem and then move it to a different area in the Bronx. These people go in all different directions, and it makes that type of communal living extremely hard for these people, because that communal living is based off of how long you stayed in that neighborhood and the continuity and the relationships that you form there. You don't simply form these relationships by picking up and moving your bags to the next city, right? But we say that for those who are able, we say that when gentrification another impact of gentrification is that it makes it extremely hard to adjust to the rising prices of being able to live within these areas. So people are forced out. And then the second harm we'd say is that for those who can stay, they have the same fixed income, which means that if they can't adjust to the rising prices of the rent, they have a lot less money to be able to spend on other goods, to be able to cope if their son does have a broken arm. We say that we take away these aspects of life, but we also say that's an important aspect to the culture that lives within these neighborhoods, right? It's kind of like what they thought we were going to be talking about, right? We say that the cultural aspect isn't something that we can necessarily put a price tag on, nor is it something we can say that like, well, because you're coming into this neighborhood and you're more wealthy, you deserve to like institute your culture, or the dominant culture, as Tim put it, just because you want to. Go ahead. We're not saying that the community has reached its pinnacle, but we are saying that these support systems are extremely important for these communities, and that it would be extremely hard for these people to live in a different community because they don't have those types of community structures. What they're saying is, we don't care about how you're making a living or the community structures that you have. What they're saying is, we want our property. It doesn't matter who it comes at the expense of. We're perfectly fine with saying that a government should not value property over people, right? But then, so how should you weigh this debate? How should you weigh this debate, Madam Speaker? All we keep getting is like integration and change. The integration that the integration that they're talking about that might be happening is what happens with like richer people come in and move in. That's not integration. That's a forced migration of the people who live there because they can't afford that housing. And then they want to talk about change and how America got to where it was in the end, right? We say that on the Statue of Liberty, it didn't say, give me your tired, your wretched, and your poor, so we can gentrify the neighborhoods that they got into. We said, give me your tired, and wretched, and your poor, because we recognize that there's an important thing to them, and they present an important culture. We seek to preserve that. We think people are more important than property. We're proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy, very much for that speech, and call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition to give a speech in response.
Hi everyone. So Saturday was my first day in Manhattan, and growing up in Ireland, we're exposed to an awful lot of American culture. So I do watch an awful lot of Gossip Girl and Sex and the City. So naturally, one of the things I really wanted to do when getting to Manhattan was stroll past Central Park, along Park Avenue, along Fifth Avenue. So that's exactly what I did. And I looked around the place, and I looked up at these amazing penthouse suites, and I said, me, I want to live there someday. Okay, now, I don't think that one person in any of those apartments has the right to say, you, I do not want your kind living with me. I do not want you in my community. I want to keep my community exactly as it is. I think that there is absolutely no difference to the fact that they're incredibly, incredibly wealthy and I'm not. We say that this is no different when the people who are doing the we don't want you here are incredibly poor and the people who are moving in are not. We think that the principle is the same, that nobody can reject someone from their community. Nobody can say, we are now the pinnacle of everything we want to be and we don't want you now. Because at no point in history has this been shown to be true. Whenever we look back in history, we don't look at one group of people and say, yeah, that's how things should have been. We really shouldn't have come far from there. The people who do this, I'm going to take an example out of my head, being the Amish, are an incredibly small group and are very much looked upon as, a tourist attraction, something other. We as a people, as a majority of people, are constantly trying to better ourselves and further ourselves, and that's what we think gentrification represents. Okay. So what we want to bring you to today, first of all, is the role of government. Should government get involved in this at all? Unsurprisingly, we're going to say no. The second point we want to talk about is this being afraid of change, about why change is good. And then I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of gentrification. But first of all, a little bit of rebuttal. So we heard from the first speaker, from the first proposition, that gentrification just doesn't lead to integration, it leads to segregation. But, about 2 sentences before that, he was talking about these communities as being insular, as having their own language, as, shopping in their own particular cuisine. So they're already segregated, and they seem pretty happy with them keeping that way, maintaining their own little group where they don't integrate. And we say that's not what America is about. That's not what any country should be about, forming isolated little pockets who don't allow in newcomers, okay? We think that when people feel that the only people that they are exposed to are people of their own kin and of their own culture, who maybe came from their own country, that this is necessarily not the best thing in the world. That integration is why we get to where we are. The exposure of ourselves to new ideas through people coming in and integrating with us, through us going into different new foreign areas, is how we progress as a humanity. So we think that wanting to preserve these people as having their own little isolated group with their own values and their own morals is necessarily then a roadblock in the progression of furthering these communities. So we don't think this point about stagnation really stands, okay? They've also accused us as being colonialists, but we're saying they're the ones that are monopolizing culture. They're the ones who are saying these cultures have to remain, exactly as they are. And if they want to change it, that's okay, because it's their decision, but at no point can they have any outside influence with anyone else. But that's not how humanity works. That's the way we've changed ideas. That is how, across Europe, when different groups came in contact with each other, they exchanged ideas. At the point at which you say, we don't want an influx of new people into our area, that's the point at which you say, the Renaissance probably shouldn't have happened. All those people probably shouldn't have come from Greece, bringing their ideas out, mathematics. Those artists probably shouldn't have been, wandering around Europe, drawing those magnificent paintings, and reveling in what it meant to have a skill. So the Renaissance is an incredibly concrete example of how moving into different areas, even en masse, can bring massive swathes of new ideas and new ways of thinking about the world. Your point?
When we get gentrification, we don't get the Renaissance. What we get are homogenous hipsters and homeless Hispanics. We see that these communities are divided. Why do you defend homogeneity of people that wear birthday outfits and stuff?
Well, if America is the country where homogeneity equals birthday outfits all day long, then, that's a pretty exciting place to be. I mean, I want to stay here full stop, But no, I think that's a very black and white view of what it means to be gentrified. We don't think it's, a hipster sees this area and says, that looks like a nice place to hang my glasses. And if there was a Starbucks right there, I could sit there and I could write my screenplay, which I someday hope to be made into a nice little indie film starring Zooey Deschanel, okay? That's an incredibly black and white view of gentrification. I mean, how would normally happen? It's a very slow, very insidious process. It doesn't equate to hipsters in, natives out. Okay, so it happens quite slowly. Where people see an area, they say, there's jobs being created nearby. I'd actually quite like to live here because I like being able to walk to work, and then they're willing to pay higher prices for their apartments. I mean, like First Prop said, they then have, high expectations of living, so you get your Starbucks, you get your whatnot. Now, this is kind of where a lot of the analysis from First Prop ended in terms of what actually happens, because they said that these new businesses come in. Yeah, we don't really think that bringing new businesses into, poor areas is necessarily a bad thing, because when you bring in new businesses, you're bringing in new jobs. You're directly stimulating the economy that way. So we don't think there's going to be a massive flight of absolutely everyone out. Now, we do anticipate that people will leave areas if they feel forced out of it due to economic circumstances. We do see that there will be a large pocket of people who'll be able to continue living where they are because they're going to benefit from the money that's brought in by the people doing the gentrifying. Now that they can leave high school and get a job working in Starbucks instead of leaving high school and getting a job maybe pushing drugs on a street corner is a pretty good thing. So if you think that gentrification brings that major benefit with it. Now, the people that do move, they say that they get scattered to all parts of the area. We think that if community is that important to them, if community is all they have, then they will make the concerted effort to stay as a community. When the Irish people left Ireland, they didn't just settle all over the US. There's a reason why Boston became the Irish epicenter in America. People had contacts there. People knew it as an Irish area. There's a reason why Hell's Kitchen and 5 Points in New York became Irish areas, because people knew that there was community there. We think that if people are being displaced due to gentrification, they're not necessarily going to be scattered all over the city, all over the country. They're going to find new places to live. And the people that remain are going to benefit from the money brought in by the people doing the gentrifying and the new ideas. We also think that it's going to result in these areas in less classism. At the moment, when you have working class areas and upper class and middle class areas completely divided, people have this idea of each other as what it means to be working class, what it means to be upper or middle class. We think that by blending the two, when you have a mixture of working and middle class people in the same area, you're breaking down these class barriers. You're interacting with each other. These people that you never thought could be your friends and neighbours are now becoming your friends and neighbours. Again, we see the spread of ideas. We see the acceptance of other people. So it's for these reasons that change is a good thing, that gentrification has some harms, but these can be overcome by community. And because we just we plain don't like stagnation. That's why I beg you to oppose.
Thanks, Deputy, very much for your speech and call on the member of government to open the second half of this debate.
There's such a thing as bad change. This is something that the opposition hasn't really got understood sufficiently. And that's the criteria that we're generally using today. We think that the opening government set it out rather clearly in their speeches. The time you pick which things to change and which things not to change is when you perceive systemic problems in those things and see that there are predictable results and they're predictably bad. So no, we wouldn't just say we shouldn't let the Greeks spread geometry or something like that. But when we see things that are happening over and over, like if the Greeks are spreading cannibalism or something, we'd certainly want to stop that from happening. So we see that in this case, we do actually have the criteria met for that type of thing, for some of the harms that they pointed out and the more that I'm actually going to point out a bit in my speech. So we basically had this idea that, well, we don't want to be able to keep anyone out. We don't see a difference between keeping someone out of a wealthy neighborhood and then preventing wealthy people from coming into a poor neighborhood. Well, there are clearly a few differences here. Obviously, if you're just being racist or something and saying, oh, absolutely no blacks in this neighborhood, that's somewhat different from saying we want to preserve this culture because there are actual serious harms that happen when there's this very rapid turnover, when rich people move into this neighborhood, maybe on speculation sometimes, maybe just because they want to write that screenplay or for whatever reason, raising the prices dramatically in such a small amount of time that the community fractures and is not able to actually perform the function that it needs. So that the people, as opening explained, are harmed by this. And so we think that this plan will actually enable, if changes to happen, it to happen in the right way. It to happen slowly, it to happen gradually, so that this integration can happen without actually harming people that much. And then she said, well, integration is good, that's what America's about. And sometimes we value unique contributions. What would happen if everyone were the same? The cost of that would be no cuisine. Now it's different. No unique music, no ethnic identity. These things are good as well. And though you do want to promote integration of some kinds, you do need to see that there are actual harms to that. We do recognize values in other things other than that. And this isn't really like the Amish, that's kind of a straw man. So the first thing I'm going to go into is the safety net and how this promotes that. Second is why it's the government's role, going into some of the harms of gentrification. And the third point is power, which goes along with a lot of the other points, some of the main things we want to bring with you today. So basically, the safety net. Nelson talked to you about this a little bit. I'm going to explain a little bit more why it's so important. So what happens is that if people move out of where they live, they have to go where they don't know anyone. They said, well, no, they can just actually all go to Boston or wherever, like all the Irish people did. This happened gradually. This didn't happen in 2 years, in 3 years. There were actually a huge number of people doing this. If you just move a small group of people and say the prices are going up year after year so that they actually have to move out, they'll try to move somewhere else. They don't have a job in where they are. They don't know anyone where they're going now. And they don't have the type of things they're going to need. For example, when you know people for long periods of time, you can get recommendations from those people. You know the local storekeeper. You know the people at the gym or wherever. And they can actually do things like maybe give you employment because they can trust you where you might not actually have the same types of opportunities as other people might have. If you're in the same school system for a long period of time, you get the same type of advantages because your teachers know exactly what the problems are. You don't need to go to a new area and you can't remain as anonymous so that these problems are actually able to be solved. I think generally people think that government is used as an instrument by the people to actually serve their ends. So to the extent that we can see a harm to the people that can be solved by government action, generally that's a good idea to solve it. If the method has more benefits than harms, we think it does in this case. That's why. So also you see that in local areas there are churches or other social groups where people are able to go for long periods of time. They get to know the people there so that if they have a problem, if they're unemployed for an amount of time and looking for a job, those people know that that guy would never do that on purpose or something like that. They're able to better facilitate maybe charitable giving, take up a collection. They're able to rely on friends so that they can get advice at that time rather than being in a place they aren't aware of where they might actually be able to become productive members of society again. They might have said spiral into welfare because that's easier or something else. All the advantages of alternative forms of a social safety net are caused by familiarity and personalization. You know the people in your area, so you're able to better target the needs. That's destroyed with gentrification because all these people move away and then you don't know the special needs they have. You don't have the local community and people aren't the same and don't have the same problems, so you can't fix them with as targeted of efforts. And that's a serious problem as we'd see. Also, the people, when they stay in the same areas, are able to create credit unions, co-ops, other things like that. You also see that people create certain types of community projects, for example, a senior center. Whereas if there are not actually enough of elderly people, they wouldn't provide that type of thing. So even the one that exists in an area might end up having to be shut down as more people move in so that those seniors in that area are not serviced because the middle class people that just moved in are not older because older people also a lot of times need more time to change, and this change can happen rapidly. And that's the type of thing we think can be very harmful and something that needs to actually be changed. It also prevents the accumulation of capital since inevitably poor people move away from capital so that they're not able to build the community and do things slowly as they need to get employment. We find that this is an immense harm of gentrification and a serious problem. Why is it the government's role? This is a direct question. It goes to the social safety net. It also goes to this. Crime goes up in periods of gentrification. You see this because you're allowed to be anonymous if you're in a community you don't know. People aren't able to recognize you necessarily as well, and you don't have the same bonds to people. You're not stealing from the shopkeeper you know for a long time. You're stealing from some other guy you don't know, and you're in harder times and don't have the safety net. You don't have people you can actually go to. You also see that there can be discrimination and coercion as there's foul play to get the rest of the minorities out because you don't want them in your community. We can see this, for for example, in Sanford, there was a neighborhood watch. It actually killed Trayvon Martin as he was walking down the street. He was a black child, well, not child necessarily, adolescent, who wasn't recognized by the new people in the neighborhood watch, and they distrusted him. You also see that it's a matter of power. Just think of Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals, or President Obama's efforts in Chicago. What was it about? Unifying the community to solve community problems. In Chicago, getting asbestos out of poor housing. That can't happen if you don't know people. It can't happen because it's prevented by the politics in the area, or whatever other efforts you need to actually overcome. In order to do that, you have to unify. That can't happen unless you have time. Our plan gives these people time, as change can happen slowly, gives people more choices, it benefits them, benefits the people, which is the government's role, preserves the social safety net. That's why you should vote for our plan.
So right now, I'm hoping that I'm not the only person in the room who's missing the part where Tim explained that the subsidy is based on how well you know your neighbors and how close you are with them. Because that's really what it's sounding like from government bench right now. The ties that you form and the community alignment, that it's just so strong that that's kind of basically what they're basing it on. But we think that's kind of a poor explanation of what these communities actually look like. And it's a poor explanation of the way that gentrification, specifically subsidizing it, would affect these people in the long run. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about. So we hear a few ideas that are kind of strange. So there's this idea that now this little old Polish woman who doesn't speak English won't be able to get any food anywhere. What we'd say actually is if she was likely to have to move somewhere else, probably to an area where people in her community would also be able to move. Probably that Polish business would move there also, because that's where their demographic is. We think this happens all the time, where the taste of that particular area doesn't necessarily suit the business, and the business would and should move to go somewhere else. We don't necessarily think that your business should stay as long as possible, because it's really just a sign of how great you are when you've been able to be in a particular place for a very long time. We think that it'd be better to say that you've moved around and that you followed around the community that necessarily relates to your business or wants to have those services. So basically, we also have to think about the fact that there isn't necessarily a way that we can weigh the culture of one community against another. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, because that's kind of this idea that we've been hearing. We hear the word culture thrown around, and we kind of automatically should assume that it's good or better than what would replace it, and we don't necessarily agree on our side. So, no. What do these communities currently look like? So Tim and Nelson both actually present a pretty one-sided picture of what these communities look like. It's like cultural communities that are and are not interacting with larger society. So we don't necessarily think that their existence in a particular place means that they're engaging with larger society. So all these benefits of the culture being in one particular place, we think that that's something that is only marginally felt by a certain group of people. So for example, having a Polish neighborhood doesn't mean that now the city of New York as a whole is more interested in Polish culture and Polish food because it exists. We don't think that that's how it happens. What we'd say is the people that live in a particular neighborhood do so because they can't necessarily afford to live in another place. So there are lots of harms that come from the people that can't afford to live in other places. So we see things like poor education standard, things like low tax brackets. So they kind of admit on their side that they won't be getting a lot of tax money. So kind of what you're assuming also is that the schools will probably be just as bad, and they'll progressively get worse because they'll have less and less money, and costs are just always going to increase. So it's kind of something that's actually happening under their plan. Now, so what we'd say, actually, is that there are a lot of specific barriers that are faced by these particular communities, and we don't necessarily think that making them stay in one particular place benefits them at all. So, for example, he talks about the example of commutes, why commutes are particularly difficult. We don't necessarily think that if your commute is difficult, that you can afford the $2.25, or maybe it's going to be $2.50 next time, or $3. We don't necessarily think that you can compete. So when we're talking about places that are gentrified, we're talking about places where the cost of living are generally pretty high. So if you have a minimum wage job, and even though your apartment is subsidized, it's likely that when your Metro card goes up, and the cost of food goes up, and the cost of clothes goes up, and the cost of getting your shoes goes up, and the cost of your kids' braces goes up. We don't necessarily think that that's something that you can now afford because your taxes are just so low that you can afford everything now. It's a completely false picture that they want us to naturally buy into. What we say is these communities, oh, well, actually, I'll take it a second. These communities are already struggling. These communities are probably having a difficult time putting their pennies together as it is. So what they're saying is, we want to take this particularly disadvantaged and group, and we want to force them, or not force them, we want to make them more likely to stay in a particular place where maybe it's not economically advantageous for them. But you disagree.
The reason the prices go up is because of gentrification. As more people move into the neighborhood, it puts the cost of living up. This is going to be prevented by our plans, so the cost will actually not rise.
I can definitely admit that certain rises in prices can be credited with gentrification. That probably does do some of it. But for example, when you have to commute to your job, the cost of whatever it is at your job, that's not because your neighborhood was gentrified. That's not necessarily true, no. But anyway, we see that actually on our side, what we're saying is that there are significant harms that are being posed. So the first one is the idea of cultural imperialism. So they kind of tell us that this culture is valuable. We don't necessarily believe that it can't exist anywhere else, or that the fact that it isn't in one particular community means that it isn't as good as it was before. Sure.
Have you ever heard of a community actually existing outside cities in unified communities?
Well, no, but I'm sure that they exist. The point is, I don't have to say that it's never happened before, because it doesn't mean that it can never happen in the future. That's kind of ridiculous. We think that it's perfectly fine for there to be a suburban, socioeconomically poor community that used to live in a city, and that's part of their story, whatever. So what we'd say is, in a way, this kind of discourages advancement and change. So what I mean by this is, if you live in a community where your housing is being subsidized by the government, you probably have a higher crime rate. So this is also a weird thing that he says. He says oh, if you are in a gentrified community, you don't care if you rob your local store. Actually, the opposite happens. When gentrification happens, crime rates significantly improve because there are people that aren't necessarily susceptible to the same kind of social pressures that account to crime. But the idea is that when you're in a group that's already pushed away and already kind of on the fringe, and you're not necessarily engaging with wider society, the government is less likely to go in and protect you and to provide the services that you actually need to benefit your life. So what we'd say is if you're in a school district that's kind of failing, you're not going to get better school districts because you're being subsidized to live in a particular community. That's not the way that it happens. What happens is the government says, oh, well, this particular community that kind of presents a problem for us is going to continue to do so, and we should continue to ignore them and continue to make sure that problem doesn't spread. So yeah, they're probably going to encourage people to be in these situations. So it's going to turn from subsidized housing to literally housing projects and public housing that is already really bad. And what we say is anything different isn't valued in that community. So there's no reason for why someone else's culture, I think hipsters are getting a bad rap. Why are hipsters so bad in comparison to everyone else? Maybe that's the evolution of culture that we should embrace. And Sam Vitale obviously agrees. So what we say is that anything different is necessarily less value. What we're doing is we're asking the government to place a price and kind of to weigh which cultures we want to see and which ones we don't. And we think that's especially harmful, and that's why we urge you to oppose.
Thank you, member, very much for that speech.
Coming out. Happy St. Patrick's Day. As you can see, my partner's still celebrating. But I want to get into a few points of rebuttal and then get into my three main points for the government bench. And so first, I just want to address with two quick questions brought up in that last speech there. She talked about how property taxes are going to hurt, capped property taxes are going to hurt schools. That's just not true. Schools are already subsidized by more than property taxes. For example, we have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We have all kinds of foundations and money pouring into schools. Property taxes isn't going to suddenly make city schools worse. Secondly, she talked about the subsidy and how that it's not based on community. But remember that in the model that was set up, there's two members of the community sitting on a board who have lived there for years, and they're determining this subsidy. And so the subsidy is based on living there for a long amount of time, which is inevitably all about community. And so that's what we're talking about today. All right, so I want to talk about my three main points. And that is first, the issue of change. Secondly, the issue of choice. And thirdly, the issue of time. So these are the three things. And we think that on-side government, the way we'd like to tie these three things together is that change is good when it preserves choice. Choices are good when they serve the common good and are made at the appropriate time. So that's what we believe on side government. So with this idea of change, the opening opposition, they brought up their point of change, but we feel that it's a sort of a simplistic picture. We see that not all change is good, as the opening government did a good job of pointing out, but we haven't really heard so far an answer to the question, what is the change that we need? And that answer, I find, is that the change that we need is that encourages aggregate choices, the appropriate choices that we're talking about. We want change that empowers the underprivileged classes, minorities, and socioeconomic groups. We don't need change that empowers people who already have power, the rich, the wealthy, the privileged. We don't need that sort of change. Gentrification takes away from the freedom of these groups that are living in community, and it forces them to live away from capital, and it pushes them out and scatters them to the wind. That's what we see when we see gentrification. It's not the change that we need. Since that was your point, I'll take you.
But in fact, what you're actually doing is subsidizing poor people to remain poor in poor areas rather than allowing them to develop.
Well, that was actually my partner's whole extension, is about how this community is building people so that they can be empowered. I'll talk more about that later in this speech, though. So we see that the rapid change that we see from gentrification. My partner talked about this rapid change, and the closing tried to say, well, no, this change happens slowly. It occurs over a long period of time. Just one example, Clinton Hill in Brooklyn, building went from $40,000 to $70,000 between the time period of 1984 to 1988. That short time frame almost doubled the price of the building because of rapid gentrification. That's how fast this happens. It's not a slow, gentle trickle. This is a quick, homogenous hipsters in, and thank you, homeless Hispanics. That's exactly what it is. And so that's the problem that we see. All right, so I'd like to move on to the second point that is really our main point, which talks about choice. Which system creates the most freedom of choice and opportunity for upward mobility? Now, the closing opposition posed this question. There's no way to weigh which culture is better, but we feel that's the wrong question. We're not evaluating culture, we're saying weighing the value of choices. And we feel that the value of these aggregate choices in a community are more important than the individual choice of a wealthy hipster who wants to move to Brooklyn. That choice of the community is more important as it provides the social upward mobility that can only happen with community. It's easier to say in school when you have friends, when you're in clubs, when you know teachers. It's easier to get a job at the local grocery store when you've known the clerk since you were a child. It's easier to have that sort of empowerment and to have community when you're living in a single place. Opportunity for empowerment is created by strong communities that can develop economic momentum, like the credit unions and co-ops my partner was talking about, or cultivate political power essential for protecting the disenfranchised, like my partner talked about with Obama's community organizing in Chicago. And there's no better example of this than the Cubans in South Florida, who for the last 5 mayors, they've been Cuban mayors. Recently, the most recent senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, another Cuban American. And so we've seen how the community in South Florida coming together in Miami-Dade, these sorts of areas in the inner city, these communities that are able to develop, are able to cultivate political power to protect the disenfranchised, the people who don't have the power already. That's the point, and that's the agency, that's the choice that we care about in today's debate round, and that's the choices that you should care about too, because it actually reduces crime, as we've talked about. They say that gentrification it reduces crime. Well, it might reduce crime in that neighborhood as more wealthy people move in, but as the poor people are pushed out, the crime and the ghetto follows them because they're not able to be economically empowered. Finally, the senior center that my partner talked about, what about those sorts of people? That's actually a specific example coming from Chinatown just in the past few years, where a senior center was nixed because of rising property prices and gentrification. Those seniors aren't going to be able to go there because the people moving in not only raise the property taxes, but these hipsters, or whoever's moving in, the wealthy people who are moving in, the families who want to be close, the young people who are moving in, they don't need a senior center. They're going to be directing their commercial buying power in different directions. The need of the community is no longer with the senior center, and that's a problem because those people don't have anywhere to go. And that's why I want to get into my last point, and that is about time. We feel that we need a balance of change. We think it's a good thing When the social, we think that it's a good thing when these sorts of changes move slowly. When we provide subsidies that allow low-income groups to accumulate capital, to hang on to rental property and jobs, to have that community engagement as neighborhoods are invested in by wealthier individuals. We're okay with the wealthy people paying high prices to buy apartments in low-income neighborhoods as long as the people living there are already provided subsidies that allow them to keep up with the cost of living. If a landlord wants to, upscale a building and needs a subsidy so that he can rent it to low-income renters, we're okay with that. But what we don't want to see is the rapid gentrification of diverse neighborhoods that destroys and tears apart communities that are struggling to become enfranchised in a system. If we live in America, if we live in a Western liberal democracy, we want to live in a place where those communities are empowered, not keeping the power with the people who already have it, but rather investing in communities and allowing communities to empower individuals. Thank you.
Thank the government whip very much for that speech, and call on the opposition whip to give the final speech for the opposition bench and the ground.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think there's a curious irony that the one nation which has probably provided more generations of working class individuals to your country than any other has decided to stand up here and defend the worst excesses of the middle classes, impinging on the progress of working classes. And I think Owen, Elizabeth and I also wish that we dressed in less snappy ensembles while trying to do that. The issues that we need to talk about right now, everybody, there's three big ones. Firstly, is being isolated a good thing? And Katharina and I think that it's not. Secondly, will gentrification have these harms that they talk about all the time? We think that it won't. And thirdly, will their scheme work? And once again, it's a big fat no. Firstly, just one issue of the model, which the last speaker brought up, which I was going to ignore, but I thought I may as well mention. They said this is going to be a perfectly adequate scheme and it's going to be fairly distributed because two members of the local community will decide who gets what. I can think of no less equitable way to do things than to allow the two people who are probably most prone to any kind of feuds or any petty dislikes to decide who gets what within their community. Like, if these people have implicit knowledge of who has been cheating on whom and who dislikes whom, then this is not an equitable way to do it at all. And I can't believe it was proposed as any kind of acceptable way to do these things. But that's not that important. Firstly, on the question of isolation, America as a country has a proud history of achieving more when its people are together, when they're integrated, and it's got a history that we'd all like to forget about of what happens when you segregate people. And an ideal would be everybody living together in some kind of colorblind society. We know that, of course, that hasn't been achieved yet in America, and there's some way yet to go. And we're not saying that that we were going to achieve this by opposing this model. But what we do say is that we shouldn't promote the opposite of promoting any kind of cultures or religions or ethnicities that they have to stay together. Like, the existence of Marco Rubio does not prove that social isolationism doesn't exist. There was always going to be someone who arose from the Cuban Americans in Florida who made a lot of himself, but that doesn't necessarily prove that the existence of the Cuban American community has been a great success because they stayed together. We had examples of how community helps each other. They say, like, a kid breaks his leg and they look out for each other. If a kid breaks his leg and everyone doesn't just call the ambulance, then you have a problem in your community, ladies and gentlemen. Like, and that is something that needs to be addressed in the long term. And they say, a kid would never steal from his community. But if you're the kind of kid that steals from people, then that's a problem anyway. And if you're stealing outside the community, that doesn't mean that harm of stealing doesn't exist, ladies and gentlemen. It's just somewhere else attacking some other community. And then he said that, they said the kid can get a job from a grocer he knows, i.e. he'll get something because he knows someone. Ladies and gentlemen, that is nepotism. You left Europe because of this. You left this because of what was... I can't believe you're supporting this. What does this kid actually end up feeling? This kid ends up feeling that I need the government in order for my community to survive. It promotes a sense of dependence that the government needs to be there in order for this community to continue because you don't have the strength. No, thank you, sir. And we don't think that that's the kind of thing that we want to promote. We think it promotes prejudice of the outside world where we promote as much as possible where the government encourages people to stay in isolated communities and not integrate with the outside world. If there are communities that, no thank you sir, that come from different countries, then it fails to promote language skills and learning English so they can interact with other people. And it may give you an increased sense of loyalty to your community within your couple of acres in downtown, wherever. But this gives you a decreased sense of loyalty to everywhere outside that, to your county, to your state, to your nation. That is not something that we want to promote. And just because you feel more allegiance to the people who are closest to you doesn't mean that you're promoting bonds throughout society. No, thank you, sirs. And what they've said then is that this prevents targeted interventions, because if everybody's together in one place, then it's easier for the government to target problems like unemployment or like any other social ills. And we say that places of unity, no thank you sir, and this is a really important point, places of unity can exist even when people are geographically distributed. So you may all live in one certain part of New York and have that sense of unity. But if, through some gentrification, your community moves to other areas, that does not mean that it has to be destroyed. I live in Ireland where there's a very small Jewish community, and these people are in different places around the country. But they have managed to retain a sense of community. They've managed to retain an ability to communicate with the government and get their message across, because they have things like synagogues where they interact together. They have community centers, they have youth movements, they have schools. And this thing doesn't necessarily have to stop existing because you moved a few miles outside. And I'll take you in a moment, sir, because it's moved outside their closest area. And if the sense of community is so important to these people, then they can choose, if this gentrification occurs, to try and move to the same area. They don't have to splinter. They can find somewhere in the suburbs that suits them if this sense of community is so important to their continued existence, and they can maintain that in a different place that isn't in downtown city. Sir?
But it's not just a cultural problem that gentrification brings. There's a real immediate harm if I can't afford my rent and I'm out on the street, and that's something that you don't address on your.
Okay, let's move on to the next thing then, which will address that, which is the question of increased rent. So, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, I don't think this will prevent gentrification. But even if, I don't think that this proposal will prevent gentrification, but even if it did manage to prevent gentrification, cost will go up. Now, the point from the third speaker on proposition, he said that if we prevent gentrification, then cost won't go up. But there's always some costs that do go up. The cost of living increase all the time, albeit at a slower level. What we say is that when you provide this artificial government assistance to these people, you put them in a virtual reality, that you cryopreserve these people in a world where they don't have to respond to changing economic circumstances, and they don't see increasing costs as something that they have to deal with in the most basic of a capitalist way. And so when other things happen, like when the price of food goes up naturally, and when the price of gas goes up naturally, and electricity, these people aren't as well equipped to deal with these problems and succeed as a society. And that's what I think is the real problem, sir, aside from that. This is what First Proposition said is that we are addressing the immediate needs of these people. Their immediate need is money. We say that we should look maybe a little bit beyond the immediate and look at the long term, because if you don't do that, then a lot of the time you end up not solving those problems. Finally, on the question of whether this will actually work, what we think what this actually does is feeds the demand, because if the prices have started to go up in your community, and then you have an unlimited government intervention that says that indefinitely we will provide support to your community to keep these things going, then you provide a blank check for costs to keep on going, and you feed this monster of demand which keeps all these things going. And we don't think that that really solves any problems at all. It just promotes a dependence on the government, which most of us agree we want to stop people having. So, because firstly, a sense of isolationism is an inherently un-American thing and not something that we want to have. Secondly, because gentrification won't necessarily have all these harms. And thirdly, because we think the proposition won't work, I beg to oppose.
Great. Thank you all. I would invite all the debaters to cross the house and shake hands. And now, traditionally, at the end of a public debate, there's opportunity for all of you in the audience to say what you thought about this debate. So let me give a few guidelines to this. So first of all, these excellent debaters have made this all seem very easy. Just stand up and say brilliant things for 7 minutes. Let me warn you, it's not quite that easy, so you might want to give a little bit of thought to what you're going to say and then come up and say it. And then also, please keep your comments to 1 minute and 30 seconds, all right? 1 minute and 30 seconds. You may make a comment, or you may, if you would like, direct your comment to a particular speaker and say, this is my comment, and then that speaker can get up and give a 1 minute and 30-second response. They might even say, I really didn't like that point either. Thank you. So whatever they would like to say in response, you can do that. It can be a little bit more interactive that way too. All right, and Josiah, our trusty timer, will give you a double clap when your 1 minute and 30 seconds are over. So we'd encourage the audience to come up and participate and tell us what they thought.
Well, as a hipster living in Bushwick, I obviously am in favor of gentrification, but as a hipster living in Bushwick, I always feel very guilty about that. I think that one thing that wasn't really considered was we had, largely for the purpose of debate, an agreement that this would stop gentrification, but I don't know that it would, in the sense that gentrification can often be additive. For instance, in a lot of urban centers, there are like old mill-like buildings or whatnot that aren't used anymore that can be reconverted into housing that people would use. And this wouldn't be forcing anyone out of their existing apartments, but merely the creation of new ones. I think even that kind of model of gentrification does pose some interesting problems that we didn't really talk about with regards to how these cultures interact. There may be certain preferences that a culture may have towards a level of noise or like activities that they would like to do that perhaps like white people wouldn't like very much. Like, let's say that people in my Hispanic community would like to cockfight. That is probably a little racist, but, or a better example might be boxing. Like a white person in my community might not like the violence surrounding boxing because white people don't box, with the exception of the Irish. And I think that these kinds of more nuanced interactions of culture are what make, absent just the problems of paying for food, can make even additive movements of populations to a place that a culture that might not support them may have disagreements. How we should moderate those and what the role of the government should be is a very valid question.
Professors can't stand not saying something, so I'll have to say something. I was impressed in all the arguments. It struck me that the pluralism that we assume in the urban world today. 35 years ago, this debate was the subtext of it was race, and it was black people versus white people. All the gentrifiers were white, and all the people being gentrified off somewhere were black. And this argument was sort of a subset of America's racial conflicts and problems in the 1970s and 80s. But from listening to what the debaters said tonight, it struck me that there's much more of a pluralism. I didn't get that white versus black kind of thing that you would have gotten 35 years ago or 30 years ago. It's just an observation on the evolving nature of urban environments, that they're very much more complex and more pluralistic now than we envisioned them, at least not that long ago. So that's it.
I thought one of the fascinating points in this debate was the idea of isolation, and do we value isolated communities, and what are the harms and benefits there? And I just had to think of, well, Chinatown. Do we really not do we not benefit from Chinatown because it's isolated and because they're more insular, and therefore the rest of the society has no access to it? I don't really think that's true. I think the fact that it is concentrated in one place and we can go experience it more to its fullest and visit these places actually is an added benefit to the rest of society. And I didn't really think that the harms of isolation were really drawn out well enough. I'd like to really look into that and see, are there negatives to these people in Chinatown not integrating with the rest of society, or not learning the language as they should, or older people just staying within their own racial or socioeconomic community. But I thought that was a very interesting point. I'm glad it came up. I would have liked to have seen more of it. Thank you.
It's been a while since I spoke, but we'll see what we can do. I thought what needed to be was kind of like added to the conversation, especially from the government side, was mainly about why like people, the gentrifiers, even come into these cities. So like people from Vermont, to pick on Sam more, is because of the culture, right? I mean, like the word bodega is like a particularly like New York Spanish word that everyone uses now because it's really hip. Like everyone wants to be like Brooklyn and represent Alcanza. And so like that sort of thing, like if they're more apt to actually protect the culture that's there instead of conquistador it out like Tim talked about, which was great anyways. I thought it was huge from the opposition you should have missed on is like, I mean, Noah gets up here and says how like the people that know each other are the ones who are gonna fix the problems and like it was asbestos in the schools. I mean, that's like a huge argument for the opposition to say like these are the people that are, you know, fine with the problems. Like they don't even actually recognize them as problems, like lead paint, for instance, right? Like, so like we need people that like teach for America and they come and like try to save the neighborhoods because they bring some benefits there. So I think, you know, while like they come for like the exotic fetish of being cultured, I think there's still some net benefit that the opposition can talk about.